am on, I think. I know we're being recorded. Can you all hear me? Hello. Hey, Harry Buckwalter. Harry Buckwalter. That got recorded. That's will be on YouTube now for however long that goes. I don't know, how is the volume? Can you all hear me? Okay, do you all have notes? Dan Vanderstelt has notes, and there's some folks over here who don't have those. So Scott's going to get notes. Anybody else? Boy, you're a rambunctious group today. Yeah, as soon as these notes arrive, I'm going to. Hobbs, have a seat. All right, today we're looking at Lesson 3, which is entitled Responding to the Election of President Joe Biden. Now that could be obviously controversial. I don't really mean it to be controversial. I do think that it's right of us to try to evaluate leaders through the lens of a Christian worldview. And so that's my hope today, that we can do some of that. We could say a lot more, but what we are going to say, I think, will be significant, and I hope it'll be helpful to you. So I've got 4 or 5 major headings, and so we'll just start and we'll work through these one at a time. The first one is all authority is established by God. Is there another copy of the notes, by the way? I should have. You're not going to use those? Yeah, I'm not surprised by that. All right. I want to see what your fill-ins in so I don't miss one of them. So that first one, authority, all authority is established by God. And I do think it's important to emphasize this, given the way in which the election happened, and then the protests after the election, and the storming of the Capitol building, and just the level of division within the culture over all of that. And at some point, I think, as a Christian, you have to say that ultimately God does determine who is the leader of this land or any other land. And so we do need to submit to that. And so here's some scriptural support for that. I could add to this list greatly, but I chose just 2 passages, Daniel 2 and Romans 13. And in Daniel 2, the most important lines there, that's in that second line, he removes kings and he sets up kings. And so do we believe that? From a Christian worldview, I think we've got to believe that that is true. He removes presidents and he sets up presidents. In the other reference there, again, kind of in the middle of those 2 verses, therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And so the words there, the most important ones, would be what God has appointed. Now, there are 2 caveats that I'll share with you, and that is that the responsibility to submit to governing authorities is not absolute. We do understand that, don't we? And I've given you some biblical references later if you want to look those up on your own. The first one from Exodus is the Hebrew midwives who refused Pharaoh's order to put the baby boys to death because Pharaoh wanted to exterminate the Jewish race. And they did not obey him, and the text says that God honored their faithfulness. And so there's an example where they actually did not submit to governing authorities, but they did so in a way that God honored. And the other one is Acts 4 and 5, where the apostles are told to not preach in the name of Jesus, and Peter's response is, we must obey God rather than man. And so there are times when the church has to say, we will not submit to the governing authorities in this issue or that issue. And particularly if it infringes upon religious liberty, I think that line has been crossed. The other caveat would just simply be this: the church must exercise a prophetic role in the culture. I mean, if the church doesn't do that, well, who is going to do that exactly? Somebody has to. And I think it's pretty obvious that if the church doesn't, on some of these issues, nobody's going to speak up. And so those are the caveats, that we are to submit to governing authorities, but that submission is not absolute, but we should be good citizens of the state. As much as possible, we should be. So the first thing I want to say beyond that, in terms of responding to the election of President Biden, is the response of the Catholic Church. So that next fill-in would be Catholic Church, the response of the Catholic Church. Now, I'm not a Catholic. I know there's a few folks in the room here who have some background within the Catholic Church. I'm a Protestant by conviction. And so I recognize that there are a number of theological areas where I do not agree with the Catholic Church. I like to point out to people that we should really think about, how do you understand the church? It really should be understood by gospel continuity rather than historical continuity. Do you know what I mean by that? Sometimes Catholics will say, well, we are the one true church because we can trace our origins all the way back, they would say, to Peter, the first pope. And so it's a historical argument. It's historical continuity. And I would simply say, as a Protestant, that's not sufficient. The gospel defines the church. It's gospel continuity that defines the church. If you read church history, it's wherever you find the faithful preaching of the gospel, that's where you find the church. And there have been times throughout church history where that, quite frankly, has not been found within the context of the Catholic Church. There was a reason that Martin Luther did what he did. And so I'm a Protestant by conviction. Having said that, I do respect Catholic moral teaching. And I'll also say that I have much more in common with conservative Catholics than I do with mainline liberal Protestants. That's just a fact. And so I recognize, too, that Joe Biden claims to be Catholic. There, I believe, are 11 Catholics within his administration, and all of them are far left theologically. But the Catholic Church has made some statements after the election of Joe Biden. One of them was the day of the inauguration, and it came from the United States Council of Catholic Bishops. So this is the highest level of authority within the United States in terms of the Catholic Church. And I want to read to you what they wrote. Two statements, one on the day of the inauguration and then a second statement that came shortly thereafter. And these are in response to Joe Biden's positions, and in particular, some of the executive orders that he has issued in the first week of his administration. I believe there were maybe 19 of those, and there's more now. And so he's been very busy. And so here's the first response. It's quite lengthy. I'm just reading pieces of it to you. It's written by the President of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. My prayers are with our new president and his family today. I am praying that God grant him wisdom and courage to lead this great nation, and that God help him to meet the tests of these times, to heal the wounds caused by this pandemic, to ease our intense political and cultural divisions, and to bring people together with renewed dedication to America's founding purposes to be one nation under God, committed to liberty and equality for all. So far, so good. Then he writes, at the same time, as pastors, the nation's bishops are given the duty of proclaiming the gospel in all its truth and power, in season and out of season, even when that teaching is inconvenient or when God's gospel truths run contrary to the directions of the wider society and culture. So I must point out that our new president has pledged to pursue certain policies that would advance moral evils and threaten human life and dignity. And by the way, I'll stop there. If you use the word evil in our culture, that says something. Because we're living in a relativistic culture. I'm old enough to remember when the buildings came down in New York City in 2001, and there was a big discussion, should we use the word evil to describe what has happened? Because if you use that word, it's loaded with worldview significance. The only way that evil makes sense is if there's a category outside and above us that is defining right and wrong for us. So to call Biden's actions as morally evil is really quite a powerful statement. So I'll read that again. So I must point out that our new president has pledged to pursue certain policies that it would advance moral evils and threaten human life and dignity. Most seriously, in the areas of abortion, contraception, marriage, and gender. So marriage and gender, you think LGBTQ+. Of deep concern is the liberty of the church. That's my deepest concern too. The whole issue of religious liberty. Can we hold to our convictions given where the state is going? Deep concern is the liberty of the church and the freedom of believers to live according to their consciences. For the nation's bishops, the continued injustice of abortion remains the preeminent priority. Preeminent does not mean only. We have deep concerns about many threats to human life and dignity in our society. Abortion is a direct attack on life and also wounds the woman and undermines the family. I really appreciate the statement, it wounds the woman. Young women who have abortions are hurt by that. It is not only a private matter. Of course, that's a direct statement against people like Planned Parenthood. This is a private matter. It's not a private matter because it raises troubling and fundamental questions of fraternity, solidarity, and inclusion in the human community. In other words, there's two individuals, the mother and the child. There's two lives here. It is also a matter of social justice. We cannot ignore the reality that abortion rates are much higher among the poor and minorities, and that the procedure is regularly used to eliminate children who would be born with disabilities. An additional statement was released a week or two after Biden came into office, and it was in response to the Mexico City policy. Do you know what the Mexico City policy is? Have you heard of that? The Mexico City policy is a policy that has prevented U.S. taxpayer dollars from being used to promote abortion in developing countries. And Biden has rescinded by executive order the Mexico City policy. So your tax dollars are being used to fund abortions outside of the United States in the developing world. And so this paragraph I'm going to read to you also comes from the Council of Catholic Bishops, and it's a response to that executive order. It is grievous that one of President Biden's first official acts actively promotes the destruction of human lives in developing nations. This executive order is antithetical to reason, violates human dignity, and is incompatible with Catholic teaching. We and our brother bishops strongly oppose this action. We urge the president to use his office for good, prioritizing the most vulnerable, including unborn children. As the largest non-government healthcare provider in the world, the Catholic Church stands ready to work with him and his administration to promote global women's health in a manner that furthers integral human development, safeguarding innate human rights and the dignity of every human life beginning in the womb. To serve our brothers and sisters with respect, it is imperative that care begin with ensuring that the unborn are free from violence, recognizing every person as a child of God. We hope the new administration will work with us to meet these significant needs. And so I would just simply add these words. It's always been my conviction that the womb should be the most sacred place in the country, and that to go into the womb for the reason of destroying innocent human life, I agree with the statement here, it is a moral evil. And Joe Biden is adamantly committed to the pursuit of that moral evil. And he's showing this by his executive orders, by doing away with the Mexico City policy. So again, my tax dollars and your tax dollars are paying for abortion outside of the United States. He's also deeply committed to doing away with what is known as the Hyde Amendment. Have you heard of the Hyde Amendment? This is from Congressman Henry Hyde, who's no longer living. He was a Republican congressman from, I think, somewhere in the Midwest, but I don't remember which state. But in the 80s, this has been in place for a very long time. It prohibits U.S. tax dollars being used to fund abortions in the United States. And when it was put into effect many years ago, the thinking on abortion was safe, rare, and legal. The word rare, it should be rare. That language has been removed a long time ago because it suggested that there's something wrong with abortion. If it's rare, it must not be really all that good. And people in the pro-abortion community are so committed to making this mainstream. But when the Hyde Amendment was put into effect, it received bipartisan support. Democrats and Republicans supported it, including a certain senator by the name of Joseph Biden. And now he has completely reversed himself on this, and he is committed, his administration is committed to doing away with the Hyde Amendment. Now they can only do that through Congress. The Mexico policy he could do with executive order. The Hyde Amendment, he has to undo that through Congress. But he's going to try to do this, and if he's successful, then your taxpayer dollars will be used not only to fund abortions overseas, they will be used to fund abortions in the United States. So regardless of what you think about abortion, and obviously, you know, I'm pretty much showing my cards here, but even a person, so Biden's position in the past has been, I have my personal viewpoint, I personally don't think it's right, but I'm not going to thrust that upon everybody else. Now you have to ask the question, do you think that's a consistent, honorable position to hold? You think it's wrong, but you're not going to force other people to agree with you. I don't think that's a very honorable position. But he was in support of the Hyde Amendment because he felt like we should not force other people to violate their conscience. But now it's like, we don't care about your conscience, and we're going to take your tax dollars and we're going to use those to provide for abortion. So in the past, in the 80s and 90s, everyone was agreed that that's wrong, but that consensus is now gone. And it's really just power. Who has the power to push their agenda? So the next thing I want to talk about,
Pastor?
Yes.
One thing about the Hyde Amendment, it does not include states from using state funds, which is why in Oregon, the state funds are used to provide abortions. So
Yes.
that's still an ongoing evil. I wish we were all like the states that do it.
Thank you for sharing that. All right, I want to say something about just assessing Joe Biden's call to unity, because if you listen to his inaugural address, 21 minutes in length, and if you've just listened to Joe Biden as a candidate, he's really presented himself as sort of a moderate on the left, you know, within within the Democrat side of candidates as he was running for president. He tried to position himself as sort of the moderate in that group. And now he's saying we need to be unified, and the country has been torn apart over the last 4 years, and I'm going to be the unifier. And so that's been a major emphasis of him as a candidate. It's also a major emphasis of his inaugural address, and it continues to be at some level an interest that he expresses. I mean, he was in the Senate for decades and decades. He knows so many people on both sides of the aisle. Bob Dole has been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. The president went to his home in Washington, D.C. to visit him because although Bob Dole is a Republican, very conservative, I like Bob Dole. I'm a personal friend of Bob Dole, is the message that Biden is sending by doing that. And so let us be unified. So again, in his inaugural address, he spoke for 21 minutes. He used the word unity or various synonyms a total of 19 times. That's almost 1 a minute. So he's going to be the unifier. And is that a fill-in? But his view of unity is this. As you listen to him and then evaluate the actions that he's taking, he's essentially saying to the other side, let's be unified, but the way we will be unified is by the other side basically collapsing and caving in on their deepest held convictions. So let's have unity, but what's going to be crucified or sacrificed for the sake of unity is truth. Okay? So let me just read you. This is Virgil Walker. He has a podcast. It's called the Thinking Podcast. And Just Thinking Podcast, yes. He writes, or he states actually, I think for those of us who are believers and who have a biblical worldview, okay, this is a worldview class, right? So he's just used our language. For those of us who are believers and who have a biblical worldview, it's incredibly important to establish what's meant by unity. The Bible never calls us to unify from a standpoint of conformity. The Bible demands that unity is always established on the basis of truth. And so that we need to unify with and connect ourselves is a standard of truth and truthfulness that the Bible commands, and it's under that banner that we actually unify. So do you understand what he's saying? There can really be no unity with honesty and integrity unless that unity is rooted in something called truth. Because Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, never live by lies. And so if you want to state it that way, I don't have a problem with that. Joe Biden, I think his call to unity is, if you're a conservative or if you're a traditionalist, you've got to swallow truth or abandon truth or just press truth down and agree with the progressives and the progressive agenda, and we will move forward unified. Now, I got to tell you, that comes across as being quite arrogant. So that's pretty harsh words, but that's actually how I feel about it. J.C. Ryle, a 19th century preacher slash evangelist many years ago, wrote these words. He said, "Peace without truth is a false peace. It is the very peace of the devil. Unity without the gospel is a worthless unity." And so if you do believe that, in the statement I read earlier, that where the Catholic bishops say that abortion is the preeminent issue, it's the preeminent moral issue of our day, for him to come along, even as President of the United States, and say, let us be unified, but let you just fail to live out of your deeply held convictions and to deny what you believe to be truth, I just don't think that's a way that people from a Christian worldview can come around and be unified in the way that he's calling for. Yeah, Dan?
You know, it seems like for a progressive, a person with a really opposing biblical
Well, yes, obviously the media plays a massive role in all that we're talking about. And when you said that, it made me think of the way the media is fawning over Jill Biden and the way that they heap scorn on Melania Trump. They would say things such as she can't speak good English, even though they're the policy that's so concerned about immigration. And she speaks 5 languages, by the way.
For them, that's true, right? That Joe Biden promotes unity, that's truth to them, because it's been repeated.
Yes.
But it's not borne out in action.
Yes, so that's the major point. Actually, I'm glad you stated it that way, because that's what I'm wanting us to see, is that there's a difference between what someone says and what someone does. And so at the level of what Joe Biden says, he's all about unity, but his policies are not unifying. And so what do we do with that? So that leads us to our next point. For Christians, unity has to be rooted in truth as revealed in Scripture. Okay, so that takes us back to the opening 2 weeks of this class, and particularly back to the presuppositions of last week. You know, the presuppositions of a Christian worldview. What are the assumed truths of a Christian worldview? And one of those, I think is presupposition number 2, reads as follows: the Bible is God's objective truth for all peoples, for all times, and it's a completely trustworthy guide for life. Do we believe that? Is that central to our Christian worldview? You know, is that in your bloodstream, so to speak? I mean, I hope it is. It really needs to be. The Bible is God's objective truth for all peoples, for all times, and is a completely trustworthy guide for life. And so any call to unity that is really calling us to violate our understanding of truth and our deeply held religious convictions, well, that puts us into a place where I'd just put it this way. To be frank with you, President Biden's call to unity without truth is unprincipled. And that's a fill-in for you. You know, a call to unity without truth is an unprincipled call to unity. And I just don't think that we can just, you know, collapse before the other side on this and say, yes, for the sake of the country, we will be unified, even though that means that we have to jettison truth. All right? So Christians cannot submit to a unity of convenience. Okay, that's a fill-in too. We dare not live by lies. When Alexander Solzhenitsyn was banished from the Soviet Union after spending 8 years in the Gulag, he eventually got out, but he continued to be a problem for the Soviet authorities, so they eventually just banished him. He wrote an essay on the way out the door, and he came to the West, and he said in that essay, our way must be never knowingly support lies. We cannot ever knowingly support lies. And that's really where this worldview class came from in my own thinking. As I just look at where our culture is going, I just continually believe that we are, as a culture, supporting and believing lies. And we dare not, we cannot support lies. We must be the people who speak for truth. I said this just the other day. I had a great conversation with a couple. Actually, they're in the room right now. And in the course of that conversation, I made the observation that every person in this country is a theologian. We all are. The only question is, will you be a good theologian or a bad theologian? And it was in the context, if you don't hear truth from the pulpit, where are you going to hear truth? And the broader context was there are so many pulpits in our country, you know, the so-called seeker-sensitive church, where we won't speak on certain topics because we don't want to offend anybody. I fear that the seeker-sensitive church has done us so much harm, because while the pastors have been muted, the Bible says this, but I don't want to say that because it might make someone uncomfortable. All those people who aren't hearing it from the pulpit, guess where their theology is coming from? What's the answer to that? It's coming from the media, and it's coming from the culture, and it's coming from the classroom, and it's coming from the college classroom. So everybody's hearing messages, they're absorbing those messages, and the seeker-sensitive church in America has been too cowardly to speak truth. And I fear a lot of pastors will wake up some Sunday morning and realize the congregation's against me. Because I actually still do believe the Bible, but I haven't preached the whole counsel of God's Word. And given my foolishness, my congregation has become lousy theologians, and now they have no interest in what I believe because they don't believe it. And so our silence is deafening, and I think it might be lethal to us. And so again, the biggest need of this moment, I really do believe, is courage. That we will stand for God's truth and be courageous in doing so, and be unashamed in doing so. Because, of course, the culture is terribly committed to shaming people for believing biblical truth. A watershed event happened in the year 2015. Several things happened in the year 2015. That was the Obergefell decision, which legalized same-sex marriage, but I'm not thinking about that. This happened several months prior to. In the state of Indiana, the governor in the state of Indiana at that time was a guy by the name of Mike Pence. And Mike Pence, with the support of the legislature in Indiana, affirmed by a good majority a version of the Defense of Marriage Act. Now that goes all the way back to the Clinton administration, when Clinton was president and Republicans controlled the Senate and the House. And I believe the vote in the Senate was 97-3 in favor of that legislation. So in Indiana in 2015, so how many years is that now? It's 20-some years later. They basically took that piece of legislation which Democrats and Republicans had affirmed in the 90s by a vote, I believe, of 97-3, and they said, we're going to affirm this as a state house, and the reason we're doing this is because we are interested in protecting the religious liberties of our people and our churches. You guys remember this? It was a fairly big deal back in 2015, so 6 years ago. Now, it passed in the state of Indiana, and the governor, Mike Pence, signed it. It was not an attack upon the sexual revolution in our country. It was instead a defense of religious liberty, given the threat that sexual liberty is to religious liberty. Does that make sense, sort of? Now, here's the watershed event. It wasn't that they passed this. It was the response after they passed it. You know what I'm getting at? Maybe for the first time in American history, business, big business, got deeply involved in these issues and came down squarely in the camp of the LGBTQ community. And they went to the senators and the congressmen in the state of Indiana and to the governor, and they said, if this goes forward, we will punish you economically as a state. And what did Indiana do? They backed off. They rescinded the legislation. And that set a precedent. That was the beginning. And we are seeing this more and more and more in our culture, to where there's this alignment of progressives in terms of politics, a radical liberal media, and then big business, including big tech, who are silencing contrary viewpoints or traditional viewpoints, and they have enormous power because they have economic power and they coerce. And so I'm beginning to think of this as the evil trinity, you know, of progressive politics, a liberal media, and the business community. That in the past, the business community was, we don't get involved in politics because we realize we want to sell our products to everybody. And that held for generations. Plus, there was a certain integrity in that, because guess what? CEOs of company are not elected government officials. You can't vote them out of office. But now they've taken a position, and their position is, we will support sexual or erotic liberty over religious liberty. Okay? And so where does that leave us? Do I have another fill-in? The last one there. The great struggle in our culture. And I think this is, if you're to crystallize it in a sentence, this is where we find ourselves. This is the great struggle. The great struggle in our culture is between religious liberty and erotic liberty, or sexual liberty. And when those two come into conflict, the Biden administration is going to side with the later every time. Okay? Does that make sense? It's really important in my mind that you understand what I just said. The LGBTQ plus community, whenever religious liberty comes into conflict with that community, the Biden administration is going to side with erotic liberty every time. And there's an irony in this, because what do we know about the U.S. Constitution? Particularly the First Amendment. There is a guarantee of the protection of religious liberty. There isn't an amendment protecting the other side on this issue. The Trump administration, regardless of what you think of Trump, and I know I've kind of kept my mouth shut, I think Trump, I really agreed with Trump's policies. I think Donald Trump as a man had deep, profound character flaws. And I think he really demonstrated that, you know, in the last part of what happened here. That's my viewpoint. You don't have to agree with me. But I agreed with his policies. And I think his policies were good for the country. And so I view the Trump administration as sort of hitting a pause on so many of the issues we're going to be talking about in coming weeks in this class. It gave us a reprieve. And the Biden administration had a number of evangelicals within it, including the Vice President, Mike Pence. And so he had, I think, a very good administration. And part of this is, you know, COVID and Trump's tweeting has cost us so much, because I think he would have been reelected. But he wasn't. So, but the Biden administration respected religious liberty in a way, the Trump administration respected religious liberty in a way that the Biden administration never will. And we've got to just acknowledge that as a fact. And then how do we respond to that as people of faith who are facing this reality that particularly the LGBTQ plus community, they're going to pressure us in lots of ways. And we'll talk about that in weeks to come. Let me just stop and ask. We have a few minutes. I do have a discussion question as well. But before I ask that, are there any observations? Anything you don't agree with, or someone want to throw a brick at me for something? Or I got to take him first, because last week his hand was up and I had to call the class. So if I don't let Sam speak this week, I've really, but I'll get back to you. Go ahead, Sam.
I'm just not really sure about how sexual liberty is coming in
I'll give you one example, okay, because the time is limited, but I'll give you one example. And this example does, in a sense, come from the horse's mouth. I personally was talking to representatives of Corbin University in Salem. So here's the scenario. You're a student at Corbin University, which is a Baptist liberal arts college. It's a Christian university. You're a student there. And over the summer months, you come out as gay. And you go back to school in the fall, and you've gotten married. You're a young woman, and you're gay, and you've married another woman. Or you're a young man, and you've married a man. So now you're a Corbin University student, and you're married in a same-sex relationship. Now, from Corbin's religious belief system, their deeply held religious belief system, you don't have to agree with this, right? There's a different issue here. Do you believe that Corbin University, that their belief system should be respected? Yes or no? You don't have to answer that. I think they should be. Even if I don't agree with their position, I think they should be respected. The Constitution says they should be respected, that they have the freedom of religion. Okay, Javier Becerra, who is Joe Biden's nomination to lead HHS, which is Health and Human Services. It'll be the most powerful bureaucratic structure within the government to enforce these issues. Javier Becerra has said, and I'm not making this up, these are his words, religious liberty extends only to the individual, not to the institution. What is a church? The church is an institution. Javier Becerra is saying religious liberty does not extend to the individual, to the institution, only to the individual. So if I personally think that gay marriage is against Scripture and is wrong, I can believe that in the privacy of my own mind. But that's the only place I have the freedom to believe that, because it extends only to the individual, not to the institution. If Javier Becerra is director of HHS, and if that agenda gains steam, that student at Corbin University who says, I'm married in a same-sex relationship, I want married student housing, and I want to be fully accepted in this university, even though my position violates your doctrinal statement, it violates all of your covenants. And the university says, I'm sorry, we cannot allow this because of our deeply held religious beliefs. The Biden administration will say, you will allow it, or we will punish you. And one way we'll punish you is we will not allow any of the loan programs that allow students to borrow money to go to college, like the Stafford loan, the grant programs. All of those will be off limits to you. Now, I personally think that's an attack on religious liberty. And I think that is something that we should be absolutely frightened of. So I don't know how you respond to that or whether you agree with that. See, there's two issues here. One is, I think same-sex marriage is fine, and I don't agree with that, but that's not the issue here. It's a separate issue. It's the issue for those who don't think it's fine, do they have the freedom to run their institutions and their organizations according to their deeply held religious convictions? So a second example would be it was a baker in the state of Oregon who was fined $135,000 and put out of business. This was back when Biden was president, because the baker felt that they were an artist and baking a cake for a same-sex couple was an expression of art. And they said, I cannot, with a good conscience, as a conservative Christian, bake this cake in order to celebrate something that I don't believe honors God. And so it gets into the issue of conscience. It gets into the issue of worldview, the deepest values within a person's heart. And the state of Oregon said, we don't care about your conscience and we don't care about your religious liberty. You will bake this cake. And he said, I won't. They fined him $135,000 and put him out of business. So again, that's where Javier Becerra says your religious liberty extends only to you as an individual. It has no bearing in anything in terms of business or institutions. As a pastor, it's not that far removed from them saying, well, your religious liberty doesn't extend to you, to this church. So if I get up and preach Romans chapter 1, which says that homosexuality is a sin in the sight of God, they can say, well, you can't really preach that because, you know, you're an institution and we're limiting your freedom. I used to hear things like that, and I just thought, that's absurd, that's ridiculous. I just scoffed that off. I no longer do that. In fact, where was it at? It's not in the United States. It's in a country in Europe. Just within the last 2 weeks, every pastor's sermon has to be submitted to the government before he preaches it. Where is it at? Denmark. Denmark. Think about that, Sam. Before I get up to preach my sermon, I have to submit my sermon to Governor Brown in order to get permission to preach it. That's coming in Denmark. And I don't know why that couldn't come here. Several years ago in Austin, Texas, the mayor of Austin, Texas tried to do that very thing, and it created a huge controversy and eventually was overturned. So I hope you can see the difference here between, on the one hand, is same-sex marriage right or wrong? I would think that people on the left who are good-willed people could say, I think that's right. But I don't think that that should be shoved down the throats of everybody else who happens to have a deeply held religious belief that says it's not right. And what's happening now, in the 60s, liberals were the ones who were all for free speech on the college campuses. We're for free speech. We're for a broad spectrum of ideas. The new left talks tolerance, but they're incredibly intolerant with anyone who disagrees with them. Okay.
Well, you just described my point. The social engineering that's taken place over the last 50 years is incredible. And it's simply because we have allowed it to take place and not voiced our expressions. And it's slow, and it's going to continue to happen unless we stand up as Christians and take the Christian worldview.
Yeah, and some people are arguing that it's already beyond what you're saying. And they're saying the battle is lost, and what Christians need to do is really create alternative culture. Almost like what happened in the Middle Ages with monastic type institutions, where we preserve our values and beliefs and we weather out the storm and wait for better days. I don't know if I totally agree with that. I think we need to do both. But this class is about trying to prepare us for where the culture is at. And I'm hoping to make arguments to people like Sam that make sense to him. And he says, I hadn't thought about that. And I realized that for people to restrict liberty in that way is fundamentally unjust. And I think it is. Here's my question, though, and we've got to close. But I'd ask you to think about this. Despite what I've said, this is also true. What does it mean to be a Christian citizen? How should those with a Christian worldview respond to the Biden presidency? How should our response be different? That's the most important one. How should our response be different from those operating out of a non-Christian worldview? And I've got a text for you to read and think about with these questions, Jeremiah 29:7, which the context of that is the people of God in Babylonian captivity. They're in the midst of a secular culture. And that verse talks about how they're to pray for their culture, they're to be good citizens in the midst of their culture. And I think that's a call to us as well. We've got to disagree, we've got to speak with courage, we've got to be convictional, but we do not want to do that in the way the other side did it with the Trump administration. The level of vitriol, the level of lies, and the level of hatred. All of that is diametrically opposed to the Christian worldview. We've got to speak truth, we've got to do so with love, and we've got to do so with conviction and even with humility. And that's really hard for us to do. But we've seen the other side do that very badly. And I remember Michelle Obama said, what did she say? They go low, we go high. That was a joke. Because the other side just went really low. And my fear is that we'll go really low too. And I think we've got to ask the question, how do we speak truth, but do so in a respectful way, in a loving way, really desiring the best for those with whom we disagree?
Yes.
And you live in a world, right? I mean, not so much now with COVID, I suppose, but Kathy has worked in Portland, and you're surrounded by people who do not share this worldview. And I don't know if they heard me today. Some would say perhaps, well, he's got a point. Others might just totally dismiss me and say, I'm just totally angry over this. I don't know.
We would be in a place where we could totally be blackballed, but the nice thing, I mean, we're supposed to be light, and we have that opportunity. We just have to be brave. Try not to worry about it.
Yeah.
God's there.
All right. Well, we are out of time. And so I'm gonna ask, again, 3 of you to pray. And what I'd like us to pray briefly about is this issue, you know, how do I be a good citizen of the United States in this culture at this time? And let me just read that text, Jeremiah 29, verse 7. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile. You know, the Babylonians, this is a very pagan culture. Seek the welfare of the city, of the culture of Babylon, where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. And so what does that mean to us as citizens of this country, which is pretty much pagan? How do we live in this culture in a way that seeks the welfare of the culture while holding for truth? All right, so there's a thought